Welcome to the Patriotic Pulpit. One of the foundational planks that we try to lay here in this program is simply that this country was founded upon God. It was founded upon God-given rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and that even in the Declaration of Independence, our forefathers recognized that God created the world and he endowed men with certain inalienable rights. But many people hate the concept of God completely. They hate that America was founded upon God-given principles. But one of those individuals in the evolutionary biology science field that has been so hateful to the concept of God, just the general concept of God, not simply that America was founded upon God-given ideals, is Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins, the English biologist, the English professor, who has spent all of his lifetime arguing against God, arguing for the case of evolution, and really chastising the Bible, chastising Bible believers, and being so ugly and irritated about them, even sometimes writing what might be called temper tantrums against religionists. But here's one of the interesting things that has come across the news in the last week or so, and that is that the famed atheist Richard Dawkins now claims he is a cultural Christian. Now, he is the famed atheist, of course, who helped destroy the Christian foundation of Western civilization and culture. But he now fears what is taking place in the UK specifically, and it's also taking place in America, because something is filling that vacuum. Once you excise God out of the ideas of life, once you excise God out of the town square and out of people's lives and out of their homes, then there's a vacuum, and that vacuum is being filled in the UK as well as here in America by Islam. The author of The God Delusion, that's a 2006 book that he wrote, recently stated in an interview that he is horrified to find that Oxford Street in London had lit up its public signs and displays to celebrate the Muslim fasting period or fasting days called Ramadan. Quote, Dawkins says, I have to choose my words carefully here. If I had to choose between Christianity and Islam, I'd choose Christianity every single time. We'll come back to that in a few moments. End of quote. His concern grows as thousands of Muslim mosques are being constructed across the UK. And he adds this, it, that is Christianity, seems to be a fundamentally decent religion in a way that I think Islam is not. I do think we are a culturally Christian country, and I call myself a cultural Christian. End of quote. That's a remarkable statement coming from Richard Dawkins in light of the things that he has spent his life deriding, in light of all the things that he has written and his public stance for many, many years. We'll talk about some of that in just a moment. Continuing the interview, he tells us, quote, I'm not a believer, but there's a distinction between being a believing Christian and a cultural Christian. I love hymns and Christmas carols. I sort of feel at home in the Christian ethos. I feel that we are a Christian country in that sense. And so I call myself a cultural Christian, and I think it would be truly dreadful if we substituted any alternative religion. End of quote. Note carefully that he says it would be dreadful to substitute Christianity with any other religion. So what do we say about these things? What kind of responses shall I give here? Number one, isn't it, as one writer put it, S.A. McCarthy, isn't it a sad irony what Dawkins is actually putting forth here? Here's what McCarthy writes on the subject. Quote, what Dawkins perhaps fails to realize and certainly refuses to confess is that his entire life's work has been spent doing just that, substituting Christianity for an alternative religion, relativistic atheism. And now that Dawkins and his ilk have had some success in their efforts, they find themselves rather terrified at the godless, amoral world that they have helped to create. End of quote. A sad irony indeed it is. But there's much more to be said regarding Dawkins' statement than that. Secondly, I want you to notice that Dawkins' position, his atheistic materialism, tells us that thinking is simply an illusion of the mind. It is not drawing rational conclusion. Rational conclusions cannot be drawn by the brain, because all the brain is matter in motion. So Dawkins' own belief system, evolutionary atheism, which holds that what one loves, including Christmas carols and hymns, is but an illusion of the mind. Not that things such as Christmas carols are not real, that's not the point to be made here, or that they are illusory. But the point is, his position holds that the affections of our minds, that is what we love and what we hate, is a mere illusion. All of the affections is a mere illusion. In 1999, Dawkins jointly lectured in London with Steven Pinker, who at that time was professor in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences at MIT. Dawkins asked Pinker the following: "Am I right to think that the feeling I have that I'm a single entity who makes decisions and loves and hates and has political views and things is a kind of illusion that has come about because Darwinian selection found it expedient to create that illusion?" So note the question: what I'm thinking, what I feel, my conclusions that I draw, my decisions that I make, and what I love and what I hate, what I prefer and what I don't prefer, isn't that simply an illusion? Pinker answered in the affirmative. Absolutely, it's all an illusion. Dawkins himself is in agreement, and how else could he say, or what else could he say? That is exactly the position of atheism, that is, when you cut God out of the picture. So perhaps it is the case that Dawkins needs to recognize that his preference for cultural Christianity and his fear of Islam is not based on any external reality. It's not based upon any rational conclusion. It is not the drawing of a conclusion that is warranted by any evidence, but it is simply an illusion of the mind, because his mind is nothing more than a biological function of the brain. His brain thinking is an illusion. You might think of it simply as a bowl full of jelly. That is, we have matter, jelly, in motion, wiggling, sending out electrical impulses that make you think one way or the other way. That's exactly Dawkins's picture of the brain. And he says, therefore, the conclusions that I draw, these are an illusion. I cannot, therefore, trust. By the way, can anybody trust the thinking of a person like that? Can anybody trust his or her brain? If that is all that we think that the brain is, that is electrical impulses that are an illusion that gives us the idea somehow that we have some rational conclusion that we've drawn. I want you to listen here to another statement. This is made, I have several of these statements, but this is one by a man that I debated a number of years ago by the name of Delos McCown. Delos McCown was at that time the head of the philosophy department at Auburn University in Auburn, Alabama. He was a hardened atheist, evolutionist, and so Delos McCown wrote a book prior to that debate, and I used it in the debate with him. And the book is called Mythmaker's Magic. And he basically, of course, as you can tell by the title, was all about attacking religion, attacking Christian people, one of which I am. And so in his book, here's what he says regarding the brain. And here's what McCown says. And this is, of course, the logical conclusion to the Dawkins worldview. So listen carefully. Moreover, he says, this is McCown writing, the more we understand our brains by chemicalizing their functions, the more the person is biologized, the greater our success in mapping the human genome. I suppose that he coined a word there, biologized. That is, our brain is nothing more than biology, matter in motion. That's all he's saying here. With its myriad markers of predilection and vulnerability, the more difficult it will be to see human beings as little lower than the angels. He's quoting the Bible there. A little higher than the animals, that's what man is, but of their kind is more like it. Furthermore, some studies in neurophysiology indicate that our brains select among alternatives before delivering to conscious intuitions of choice. If so, what of the vaunted free will upon which so much of Western religion, morality, and jurisprudence is based. With notions of deity held hostage to cosmology, with the alleged spark of divinity in us deeply doubted, and with free will at risk, what stock can be placed on intimations of immortality? Precious little, if any, it would seem. Not only can we not place any stock in immortality, Delos McCown, not only can we not place any stock in not immortality and rationality, Richard Dawkins, but everything, including free will, is out the door because our brains are simply a biological function, nothing more, nothing less. That's what Steven Pinker tells us. That's what Richard Dawkins says in his conclusion. Their conclusion is your thinking and the conclusions that you draw are simply an illusion of the mind. Can you trust your brain if indeed every conclusion that it draws is nothing but an illusion? That's exactly what Dawkins tells us. So perhaps, Richard Dawkins, you need to recognize your own worldview is that you might prefer Christianity, but, put a different few chemicals in your body, and you might come out with a different chemical reaction. You might think, well, I love Islam. Or someone might just knock you on the head and say, you know what? That's what we do sometimes when, in the old time cars and things weren't working right. We go into there in the starter, we bang the starter with a wrench because, it's just, you need to get that electrical impulses going, so you bang it around. Maybe someone needs to knock people on the head and that gets them to think differently. Of course, that's all absurd, but that's what the worldview of Richard Dawkins absolutely implies. So our tastes, our fears, our loves, all of that comes from irrational sources or an irrational source, and that is our brains. It's merely the result of physical conditions of the brain. That is the quandary of those who deny God. And since all of our thoughts are only chemically and electrically induced, or biologized, as Delos McCown tells us, one of Richard Dawkins's English companions in atheistic evolutionary faith is Dr. Robert Asher. I want you to listen to what Robert Asher says. Now, Robert Asher is writing in 2020. And he states that the reason that people, now he's in the UK also, but he states that one of the reasons, if not the reason, that people voted for Donald Trump, you see, they hate Donald Trump. All these liberals, they just hate Donald Trump. And the reason that people such as myself vote for Donald Trump, says Dr. Robert Asher, was because we are affected by a mind-altering parasite called toxoplasma. So I have toxoplasma that has caused my mind to alter from this way of thinking to that way of thinking. You can't say one's right and one's wrong. So you see, free will cannot exist in the evolutionary worldview. Consequently, conservatives must be infected by a mind-altering parasite. On the other hand, we might be able to say, well, those who take an atheistic worldview, they might be having mind-altering parasites eating on their brains themselves. But the point is that perhaps Richard Dawkins simply has a mind-eating parasite, toxoplasma, according to Dr. Robert Asher. Maybe Dr. Robert Asher has come up with a medicine to take in order that he might cleanse himself from the toxoplasma, or he might give me the medicine that I need to take to cleanse myself from toxoplasma that causes me to think about one thing or the other. But in the end, one cannot say one way of thinking is right and one way of thinking is wrong. It's just the way that it is. You cannot say that one electrical impulse is correct and another electrical impulse is incorrect. But according to Dr. Steven Pinker, that's all that your brain is, electrical impulses. According to Richard Dawkins, all that you're thinking is electrical impulses. Is there one impulse that's correct and another one incorrect? No, not at all. And the same thing with Dr. Robert Asher, toxoplasma notwithstanding. Well, perhaps treatment is available in the UK and Richard Dawkins could go find treatment for his aversion to Islam and preference for Christianity. We'll be back in just a moment. In the first segment, we talked about Richard Dawkins' recent statement that he calls himself a cultural Christian. That is, he prefers in the UK cultural Christianity. Not that he says I'm a believer, but I prefer the Christmas carols, the times of Christmas, and the culture that was created around Christianity. I much prefer that, he says, than Islam. So we reflected upon that, a couple of things. Number one, I pointed out what a sad irony is that, because Dawkins has spent his entire adult life, as far as I know, arguing against Christianity, hating Christianity, tearing down the Bible, trying to eradicate any vestige of Christianity in the minds of people. That's one thing we pointed out. But secondly, I pointed out this. His worldview tells us that thinking actually is an illusion of the mind. One cannot trust a source that is irrational. One cannot trust a source that really we cannot place trust in, because that source has no validity to it. And that's exactly what he says our brains are. Our brains are nothing but chemical reactions working, physical compressions, electrical impulses. It's all about physics. That's our brain. So why can or how can it possibly be that an individual can trust his thinking? Now, along the same lines, I just want you to notice, and I pointed this out in the first segment, that it really involves the elimination of free will. I pointed that out from Delos McCown, who at one time was the head of the philosophy department at Auburn University in Alabama, whom I debated in Georgia. Oh, that was back in the 1990s, I suppose it was. But Delos McCown basically makes statements, says, our brains are simply biologized. It's a function of biology. It's a function of physics only and nothing else. Now, that was his position, and that's still his position, because that is the demand of an atheistic evolutionary position of Richard Dawkins. Well, let me just read to you a comment here. This is from Clarence Darrow. Clarence Darrow, as you know, was a famed criminal attorney that defended two individuals. I think it was in Chicago years ago regarding it was the Leopold and Loeb case in which Bobby Franks was killed. I think it was the 1930s. I don't know if I'm mistaken on that date or not, but this is interesting because it shows us that the worldview that they have really does not believe in free will at all. So here is what Clarence Darrow had to say. Nature is strong and she is pitiless. She works in her own mysterious way, and we are her victims. The mind, of course, is an elusive thing. Same thing that Dawkins has said. Whether it exists or not, no one can tell. Their parents happen to meet. These boys happen to meet. That is, he's talking about Leopold and Loeb meeting Bobby Franks. And by the way, Leopold and Loeb killed in a horrible fashion Bobby Franks. So he's saying these boys happen to meet. Some sort of chemical alchemy operated so that they cared for each other, and poor Bobby Franks' dead body was found in a culvert as a result. So it's kind of interesting here that in his defense of Leopold and Loeb, in the horrific murder of the Franks boy, that he says they just happened to meet, it just happened to be this way, chemical actions worked in the brains. And the point is, they're not responsible. There's no free will, no responsibility. So perhaps Dawkins needs to recognize that because England is turning to Islam and mosques are being built, there's no free will. They're not responsible. It's just the way the chemical reactions are working. People have not chosen willingly Islam, Richard Dawkins, no more than you have willingly selected Christianity to be the culture that you want to live in. That's just the way that the chemical reactions are working in their brains. But here's something else. This is point number 3 I would like to make regarding which Richard Dawkins had to say, and that is Dawkins and evolution and evolutionists have continued to attack Christianity. That has been the mainstay of their attack, pillaring Christianity. The atheism that Dawkins has always attacked religion, particularly Christianity, and he has charged that Christianity, or I should say faith, is how he puts it in one of his quotes, is one of the world's greatest evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. Let's stop and analyze that for a moment. It just seems like he just throws a temper tantrum against Christianity and then he turns around and says, well, I like the culture that Christianity provided. How could that be, Richard Dawkins? How could that possibly be? Because Christianity is like a smallpox virus that we have to get rid of, and it's harder to eradicate. Dawkins has spent his entire career trying to eradicate Christianity, and he calls it a great evil. But it's not as great as evil, I suppose, as Islam in his view. How is it that he wishes to live with the cultural implications of a great evil? Now, this goes back also to Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin himself wrote to his evangelist called T.H. Huxley in 1860, and he wrote these following lines. My good and kind agent for the propagation of the gospel, that is, the devil's gospel. End of quote. It is interesting that Charles Darwin, T.H. Huxley recognized exactly the doctrine that they preached, its origin, where it was derived from, and that is the devil. As J.D. Bales, who was a great preacher of the gospel of Christ and a great instructor at Harding College for many years, he commented on this line, Darwin thought he knew so much about life's origins and manifold forms, he surely knew the origin of his gospel of evolution. That is, Dawkins says he knows all about the origin of the world. He knows about the origin of the universe, the origin of religion, the origin of all of these things. And surely he knows that he is actually opting for the devil's gospel. Now, Dawkins fills out the picture that T.H. Huxley and Charles Darwin did not. And it was just an uncontrolled anger moment with this infamous statement. You can, if you look up Richard Dawkins right on the internet today, you can find this particular statement. Here's what he has to say. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochist, capriciously malevolent bully. Well, I had to really kind of work on some of those words there. Richard Dawkins is a good writer, if nothing else. But isn't it interesting? These are all Dawkins' value judgments. They're value judgments. And they are worth no more than when I say I like chocolate ice cream and you might say I like vanilla ice cream. Every value judgment that a person makes is nothing more than my own personal taste. It has nothing to do with reality. It has nothing to do with what reality is outside of myself, and that is nothing to do with anything but personal taste. That's what Richard Dawkins is doing here. So he might rant and rave and stomp up and down and get on the floor and kick like a child, temper tantrum against God, the God of the Bible and the God of the Old Testament, but that's all his own personal taste. And once again, if he goes and takes some of that plasma that one of his scientists have said they've got the cure for some of these things that cause people to be conservative, he might just take that. He might cure himself from some of those feelings about the God of the Old Testament. But here's the real issue. Why would Dawkins wish for a society crafted by God if that is his conception of God? Why wish for a culture based on biblical principles put forward by the most unpleasant character in all of fiction? Interestingly, Charles Darwin, T.H. Huxley recognized that evolution's thrust was primarily against Christianity, even though they also seem to want at least some of the moral principles and the cultural results upheld by Christianity. Well, you can't have it that way, just as does Richard Dawkins. He wants to have some of the cultural results of the gospel of Christ, a biblical-oriented worldview, but he doesn't want the God of the Bible. One of the cultural results that the Bible presents is an open and free society where dialogue is possible and where it still is possible to have open debate and discussion, even regarding the existence of God, and even against those who attack Christianity. But Dawkins better get all of it out of his system while he can, all of his anti-Islamic statements out of his system, because that which has been created in the vacuum is Islamic society, and Islam does not allow a free and open discussion, a free and open debate about the what the Quran is or Quran is not, about whether Muhammad is or is not a prophet. As a matter of fact, if Islam takes over the UK, and if those laws are implemented, I'd like to challenge the Richard Dawkins of the world to speak out just as vociferously against Allah as he did the Bible and the God of the Old Testament. You know what? He'll not be able to do so, because it is only Christianity that gives us a free and open society in which we can discuss and openly debate and argue in a rational sense some of these issues. So he better get all of that out of his system now while he still has an opportunity to do so.